And so why are we here? Can I ask if you're not to mute your phone or your thing, so we only have just the speakers at this stage. And anybody who has questions, please use the chat function. We will go and look at that in a little while, halfway through. So you'll all be aware that all farms will require a farm environment plan. So that's all farms over 20 hectares and all horticultural blocks 5 hectares. So most lifestylers will not require a farm environment plan, but there are a large number of them in the catchments. And so if lifestylers can also find some things to do, that will also help the farmers improve the water quality. So if everybody works together, then we've got more chance of improving our water. But one of the key things in my mind is why you're doing a farm environment plan is I believe it will increase the value of your properties, because there's a sort of social license that's going to be needed to own land and to look after it and look after the water. So if you chip away at these things, I believe that if you do intend in the future to sell your property, then it'll be more valuable than a property that's done nothing. But the other thing about the environment plan is that it helps your thinking. You know, there'll be things that you'll see now that on your property that you've never seen before after you've gone through this talk. You know, you just haven't noticed that they're there. And so it helps you to identify those risks, put in a plan and work out your priorities, because you can't do everything. So you might work out which is the highest priority to fix, and it's documented. If you're anything like me, if it's not on a list, it doesn't get done, because I have so many other things to get done that if I don't have a list with it out there, it just doesn't get done. So it's also a great way to document and recognize the work that you've already done, and you know, its benefits will be on a whole catchment basis. So those are the reasons for a farm environment plan. What's actually in it? Hopefully you've received the template and you've received our good management poster. That's just a small part of the resources that we have available for you. So you need a map, so you can map all the things that are on in your farm environment plan. And that can be, you'll also look at your land management units. So all farmers do this. It's based on your soil types. You have different soil types and different vulnerabilities. You'll map critical source areas and note them in your plan. You'll do an environment risk analysis, which we're going to show you how to do. And there'll be action plans. And so, as I mentioned, if you've got any questions as you go along, add them to chat. Mirka will be monitoring them for me, and I'll do versa for her. And there's a break in the middle. So this is just a first quick overview. Normally a farm environment workshop is, you know, many hours. We're just giving you an overview, but we're giving you the supporting information that you'll be able to go away and look at. And then we're offering you a workshop if you're in Nelson, Tasman, to come along and have Mirka and myself, and I'll probably also try and get a very good nurseryman, because I know a lot of you are interested in native plantings, to have there. So you'll have a good crack at your farm environment plan, and then if you've got any things that you need to talk about, you can bring along to the second meeting. So farm environment plans with larger industries. Hort NZ has, and also New Zealand Wines are working hard. I'd say that New Zealand Wines is already very well along the track to having most of their vineyards under farm environment plans. Hort NZ had got a lot of their people under a GAP sort of system. So that GAP system is for sustainable food production. And now they're just adding a EMS, and that's a environment module. And that is designed to meet most of the regional council requirements around environment plans, because all farms will need them. Fonterra, as Mirka said, has been doing whole farm plans for all of their dairy farmers. And all dairy cows are now fenced out of streams. And Fonterra has started paying a premium for milk off farms with excellent environmental practice. So they're working very hard in that space. Beef and Lamb New Zealand has designed this wonderful environment planning resource. It comes in a folder, and for those of you who are registered for NATE and pay levies to Beef and Lamb, you'll be able to get all that resource, and they're currently running workshops all around the country. And for those of you that are interested, there is also a greenhouse gas calculator for the operation as well, if you're interested in that. So a farm environment plan is a way to sort of look at the whole ecosystem health. It can be the health of the birds and insects and things that live on the property and on the land. It can also be wetlands, riparian strips, it can be your soil health, all that encompassing it. So you can evaluate the overall ecosystem health. Now, your farm environment plan, I'm a great advocate of people actually doing their own farm environment plan. Even when Mirka was doing the farm environment plan with the dairy farmers, she did it with them. And so it's actually your plan. And it's a living document. It'll change. You know, you'll have actions that you can identify. And each year you can revise it. So it really is your plan. It's not just being done, even for farmers, I don't believe. It's not just being done as a tick box exercise. You know, it should include things that are important to you and are important particularly in your catchment. It's a great opportunity to document what you already know. And if you're in the Moutere catchment, you've been getting large numbers of trees, and you're required to do a planting plan. And that is can be part of your farm environment plan as well, to get those trees from the Billion Tree funding. So it's great to be able to record, you know, new areas of plantings, and it might be, you might want to record how many predator animals that you've killed, things like that. I got a farmer, a deer farmer, sorry. I worked with him on an environmental plan and started up with a huge list of good management practices, and he was able to go through and say, actually, he's doing a lot already. So that's, you'll be surprised at how many of these things you already do. But it also identifies which ones you can improve on and how. Take some photos. Some photos of what it was like before and then after. And so that makes it even more of a living document. And it's something that you could, if you do sell your property, you can pass on to the next person. Now, the first thing you should do when you're starting your farm environment plan is know what the issues are in your catchment. because that will help you prioritize which actions you're going to do. So for instance, there could be issues of sediment. Now sediment is an issue because it blocks the gills of fish, it reduces clarity, it smothers out the insects. E. coli could be an issue that is an indicator that there is fecal contamination going into the waterway, and that affects the swimmability of the river. Nitrate largely comes from the urine production of animals, particularly cattle. So when they urinate, there's more nitrogen in that patch than the plant can take up. And as the rain comes through in autumn, it flushes that out. Anything that hasn't been used by the plant gets flushed out, passes through the soil and ends up in aquifers and long-term in waterways. Phosphate is, if the phosphate is an issue in your catchment, that largely comes attached to soil that gets washed into the waterway. Temperature is a big issue in a lot of our rivers. It's an issue in the Motueka, it's definitely an issue in the Muthuri, and that comes from the lack of shading, because our streams were designed and everything that lived in it to be shaded. So if we don't have enough shading around our streams and our rivers, the temperature goes up. The water can't hold as much oxygen at higher temperatures, so there's not enough oxygen left for the fish and the insects that grow in it. So obviously oxygen is important as well. And I've got there MCI, that's the macroinvertebrate population in your stream. You need lots of macroinvertebrates. In the insects, they graze the algae, but they also feed source for lots of other things. Now the best way is to find out about your catchment is there's a lot of water quality reports that are available on your council website, particularly in the Motueka catchment. But also for the Muthuri, and Flowers basically records there. You can see the measurements in this slide here. So they let you know, they code it to different colors. So you're wanting to be, you don't want to have any yellows or oranges colors. So you can say this particular one is the Muthuri at Riverside, and it's telling you that there's a big E. coli issue. It's in the worst 50% of all sites, and it is, they also sometimes let you know whether it is trending upwards or downwards. So it's got measurements there of clarity, of nitrogen. So you can go onto that website and find out where you are, find the closest sampling site that's being measured and know what the issue is. Catchment groups can also be an issue. And some people also take their own measurements. And that's quite easy to do. And there's lots of training going on with the SHMAC kit, where you can take your own measurements, or you can take your own water samples and you can send them off to the Hills laboratory. Right, so you'll need to do a map of your farm. And my previous experience with lifestylers is this, they turn this into a major issue. We're really lucky in the top of the south. You can go, there's a, if you Google top of the south maps, and then you can go and put your address in, and it'll take you straight to your property. You can click on the satellite part, and then you can save that file to a PDF, and you can print it out, and you can draw on it. You can draw all these things on your map. And even if I was doing a map using mapping software, I would always draw it out first. So don't get too worried about your map, but these are all on here, the sorts of things that you can go and write on your map. You can look at the different soil types, and those will be soil types that get really pugged easily, or soil types that drain it, get really dry in summer, that are different to other parts of your farm. And most of you on your own property, you know your properties pretty well, and you can put in different farm management units. Often we do different aspects. We can do the flat separate to the steep slopes. You can map your native vegetation, and you can put in areas that you want to restore. You draw in your waterways, in your wet areas, your flood zones, or your waterway crossings, you know, whether you've got culverts, laneways, any areas prone to erosion, and that can be up on the hills, or it can be on your riverbanks. You know, it's always good to note your riverbank erosions. We're going to learn about critical source areas. You can put them in. Paddocks prone to pugging, any place you stand off stock, cultivated areas, your holding pens, your septic fields, other things that might be point sources. So they can all go on your map. You can use Google My Maps to draw a map electronically to measure. So for instance, if you wanted to know how much riparian strips, you can use Google My Maps, which is a free online thing. You can also do measurements on top of the South Maps, and we can help you with your map if you're having trouble with it when you come to the next workshop. So you're going to put your name on it and a description of your property, something that looks a bit like this at the start of your map. I like to put a photo of the property on it, and I would love to get, this is a Mark II version of the Farm Environment Plan, and we need some good exemplars. So if you think you've done a great job and you don't mind sharing it with other people, you know, let me know, and we'll add it onto the resource site. So this is the sort of thing that your map might look like. You can put the color codes on and mark off the areas and measure them. This is what a Google My Maps can look like. You can put all codes for different things in there. The next thing it's really important to think about is the goals you have for your property. I have added in here financial goals, because I think that should also be in there. And the goal is the big picture. And what's written up here in this one, because this is a nationally developed one, and I didn't change it because most of those things are actions. You've got to think bigger. A goal is an overall picture. So for instance, the one there that says replace culvert in the top paddock with fish accessible, with a fish accessible culvert by June 2024 as an action. Your goal is probably something like create a stream that has an increased numbers of native fish. You know, you want your stream that's passing through your property to have lots of native fish. You know, so think big picture for goals, but also think if you do want to make money out of your property, how you might be doing that. I've added in there, are you interested in it, achieving a carbon income from your property? Are you wanting to put in some particular type of fruit trees that might generate a bit of an income? Or is your goal to be sustainable in food? Just think along those lines and really think through what you want to achieve, but also what you want to achieve for the environment. A lot of my lifestylers that I deal with just say, I just love to see all the birds flying around. So your goal might be to increase the number of birds that are in on your property. Others love wetlands. They might want to create a wetland or have wetland draining parts and lots of birds coming to their wetland. But think about, you know, water supplies and all sorts of other things in your goals. So then we've gone, the next part of the farm environment plan we've created is it lists out different components, and you've got 2 columns there. And I can't show you on this because it doesn't transfer through, but you do have something there that you can just click a box. So for instance, if you don't have any intensive winter grazing, you can just put not applicable and go through that. But if you've got some sort of management practice associated and you do have winter grazing, you can click that off. So that goes through a whole lot of different things of your current management practices. And it tags into a whole lot of good management practices. So what a good management practice is, and we'll go through them a little bit more, is what's best recognised practice in that particular area. So I've got examples here for wetlands. The legislation that's come through has got, it only applies to cattle, deer and pigs being excluded from waterways, but you might also want to consider excluding your sheep from the waterways. But you may also want to put a gate in any fences so that if you need to go in and use your sheep to control some weeds, you can. So those are all sorts of things you can think about that. And so there's ones for biodiversity. On this far corner here, you see that there's 3 or 4 different colours. And they represent the environmental risk that poses to the environment. And I'm going to talk to you about that. So this helps you prioritise things, thinking through how big a issue it is if you are not doing that good management practice. And this is what it is. So along the top here is what impact is it having on your catchment? And then down here is how likely it is to happen. So for example, in the Moutere catchment, where sediment is a major issue, the Moutere inlet is slowly filling up with sediment. You might have a section of eroding streams, for example. And it's contributing to the sediment in the area. So it's quite a significant area, and every time it rains you see that there's a brown plume coming off this eroding bank and it's contributing it. And so you might say, well, actually from my property, that's actually quite a significant high level area. And then you're going to try and assess, well, how likely is that to be an issue? And you know that every heavy rainfall event, you get some sediment off there. So you're going to either pick a high, severe and very likely, and it's red code. So you would actually code that erosion that you've highlighted as a high risk. But there might be other combinations of things that are going to have a negligible impact. So for instance, you might have a very low stocking density of sheep on your property, and they are probably having very little effect. You don't have an issue of nitrate in the catchment, so it's probably going to have a very minor effect. So just get your head around assessing those and then clicking them off in the box. I'm just going to talk briefly about point sources. This is actually quite important for lifestylers because you may have just nutrients or E. coli coming from a particular point. And Trevor James, the water scientist at Tasman District Council, has got some really great case studies where really significant issues and small stream catchments were actually coming from leaking troughs. So all the stock congregate around that trough, it leaks. And this particular one was causing a major water quality issue at a camping ground downstream from it. And you can see that here that was a stream, and every time there was rainfall, all this material was getting washed into the stream. So think about your point sources. They can be things like yards. There's a very good example here of yards. And if you do have a set of yards, look to see where the runoff's going. Is it going straight into a waterway? Very easy to fix. You can just channel that to go into a paddock, not into a waterway. You know, do you have fertilizer storage or storage of silage or things that might be passing into a waterway? Think about your septic tanks. Most time when you do E. coli source tracking in our catchments locally, you'll find that some of the E. coli is coming from ruminants, some of it's coming from birds, and some of it's coming from humans. So think about your septic tank. Is it overflowing? Are there suspicious looking green areas poking out in winter, in summer, sorry. So those are point sources, and they should be put onto your map. Now, a critical source area is basically nutrients, sediment that are coming from a diffuse area, not from a point source. And so we've got some classic sort of photos here, right along this side here. The rain's washing the bare soil down. It's accumulating all into here, and it's running into waterways. There's a really good one here too, which is a laneway. But there's things like this where stock go into areas to drink or to cross, and they can be a critical source area. And so one of the things it's really important to do is to go and, whoops, they've got them marked in there, is go around when it's pouring with rain and everything's wet and identify where those are, because you can target those with plantings, you can target them with the little bunds, you can little sediment ponds or things like that that can stop that runoff and going into your waterways. So the critical source, about 70% of the poor water quality comes from the small streams where everything flows via critical source areas. And that's the sediment, the nitrogen, the phosphorus, the E. coli. I've talked a little about the source of those, but most of them wash into the river. Even some nitrogen will wash into the river. Some nitrogen will get into the waterways from fertilizer, and some, if you've got cattle and they're not fenced out of the waterway, they love to pee and poo in water. In fact, they're 70% more likely to pee and poo in water than they are out on the paddock. So think about, but wherever they pee and poo, that all washes into an area, and there'll be certain areas that's entering the waterway, not over the whole paddock. And if we can address a lot of those, we can get a lot of those nutrients that go into our waterways from our small streams and keep them out of our big rivers. And they are all nutrients that are leaving your farm. The topsoil that's being lost and leaving your farm. So they're a loss to the farm as well. It'd be great to retain them on the property. So identify your critical source areas, put them on your map, look at it when it's running, water's running, and look where your areas of sediment is being lost, and try and work out how to keep them on the farm. And it's a lot around bare earth. If you, for instance, another thing you should be aware of is that when you cultivate a paddock, you have a much more movable bare earth than if you would direct drill it. So there's things around there that you can think about. So we're now going to go through a whole series of good management practices. And these are things that everybody's agreed are techniques that will help mitigate some land and management use practices. Some of these have been validated in some of our really earlier catchments in the Sherry River locally, where they really demonstrated the impact of fencing animals off from streams. And in Aorere, they really showed that these good management practices can have a major effect on reducing E. coli, because there used to be a plume of E. coli that headed out into the mussel farms, and they've managed to greatly reduce that. So the good management practices around stock, grazing, cultivation and cropping, erosion, wetlands, riparians, biodiversity, fertiliser and nitrogen use, infrastructure and waste management, and fire prevention. So those are the topics that we have under. So I just want to mention, if you are a lifestyler and you have stock and you're registered for NATE, then you are eligible to use all the beef and lamb resources. Anybody can use all their resources online, but you can also register to have a e-diary and a huge website resource of what's what. And if you register, then you'll get an email from Beef and Lamb saying what's on locally. And Tash Newport's from Tapawera is our local beef and lamb farmer councillor. And Warwick is the one from Marlborough, who's currently online as well, is online at this meeting. So that is pretty much me. We're going to have a short talk from federated farmers who are going to tell us, but we're just what they can offer lifestylers. But Mirka, do we have some questions? This is an opportunity to ask some questions.
Yeah, maybe I'll just go. I've kind of answered them in the chat, but one was, what is the date when farm environment plans become mandatory? So under the regulation, it's 2025. In Tasman, that's going to coincide with the rollout of the new Tasman environment plan. So councillors at the moment working on the new environment plan, and they're working towards that same date, then farm environment plans becoming mandatory. Let me just have a look what else there was. There was a question around somebody's interested in learning how to plant and maintain trees and shrubs on the farm. So that's probably one for you, yes. Annette.
Right, so I think I'll show you at the end. I think I showed it at the end here. But on the Muthuri webs page, there is a huge amount of resources for people, because if you're not aware, the Muthuri got funding to plant 270,000 native plants, and 70% of these are going to lifestylers. So on the Muthuri web page on the New Zealand Landcare Trust site, there is a resource on planting and weed control and biodiversity. That is a talk that Robert Fryer gave. He's an expert in that field. And shortly there'll also be a 2-hour podcast that was Robert, and include 2 other really good experts on how to regenerate natives. There's also a really great resource on seed, collecting seed for all your riparian plantings and plantings that if you want to grow your plants yourself. So yeah, hopefully all of those resources will help. So there's a whole heap of them there.
One of the questions was whether there's any consideration in the plan regarding controlling carbon emissions. So my understanding is that it's because at the moment when they talk about farm environment plans under the regulation, they talk about freshwater farm plans. It's not in that, but there is discussion around whole farm plans. So once they talk about whole farm plans, the greenhouse gas emissions and mitigation strategies will come under that. Under the what they call He Waka Okinawa, which is the industry partnership of primary industries for carbon emissions, there is the requirement or the voluntary agreement that all farms know their greenhouse gas footprint by 2022. So that's next year. So at this stage, the idea is all farms to know their footprint, and then mitigation will have to be reduced at a later stage.
And I think it's a really good exercise to calculate your carbon footprint of your property, and you'll be able to use the beef and lamb calculator to do that.
Then there was a question around the coding of risks, and let me just see. So if somebody is doing all the right things on their farm, do they need to code the risk as low or just not applicable? And I kind of gave an answer in the chat, but I wasn't really sure because it depends on.
So you've got
different things. But you try and answer that, Annette.
Yeah, so the first thing is you'll tick off that yes, you are doing good practice. And so therefore, if you are doing good practice and you assess, you're highly likely to assess that the risk of that is quite low. And so, yeah. So the whole idea of that coding thing is to identify the things that you want to take actions on. So yeah, you would code, yes, you're doing it, and then you would say that that's likely to, because you're following good practice, you're likely to have very little impact on the environment.
There is, I'm not sure, maybe it's not in this template, Annette, but there is also discussion around in the introduction of the farm plan to identify the inherent risk of the farm or features on the farm. So for example, certain soil types are inherently more risky to or vulnerable. Some are more vulnerable to nitrate leaching and others are more vulnerable to waterlogging. So it's just recognizing that on your piece of land, there are some inherent risks and they're either low, medium or high.
And you could certainly add that in if you thought that if you had, for instance, a very free draining, rocky soil type where the water passes through very quickly, then that has a higher risk to nitrate leaching. Whereas a heavy clay soil would have a higher risk to for pugging, for instance. So you could definitely add those in, identify them, add them in. If you wish, those tables are all in Word, you can just add them in. I also encourage you to not just tick the box, but also make a comment. You can add some words in there so that when you go back and look at it, you sort of understand you know, what you were talking about at that point.
Then the last question is quite a good one. So if you own multiple blocks or titles, is the mandatory FEP requirement for the total of the land area you own, or only if one of the blocks is over 20 hectares? And I don't actually have an answer for that. I'm part of a national group at the moment where we're trying to define or come up with some definitions. At the moment, I think it's what they call the contiguous land holding, which means if you own multiple blocks, if they're physically attached to one another, it would be one block. However, if they're a couple of kilometers apart from each other, they would be classed as separate blocks. But all of that is yet to be discussed. And somebody at MFE has to make a decision about it, what they actually mean by that. I would encourage you, if you've got multiple blocks that add up to 20 hectares, but they're all within one catchment, it's probably a good idea to do a farm environment plan, but do one plan for all of the blocks together, because it's the cumulative effect of your different blocks of land within the catchment on the catchment. That's how I would see it.
Right. So let's see if we can bring up the federated farmers.
Evening, guys. Hope you're all doing well. Am I going to be able to share my screen? Hopefully. Cool. Can you guys, hopefully you guys can all see that. So my name's Alicia. I've only just started working for Federated Farmers, but I have been in the dairy industry, in the agricultural industry since I was a very young child. Grew up on a high country sheep and beef station, went to uni, worked for PGG Wrightson's, you know, lots of agricultural industries. So I've always had a passion and always want to help people. I have a love for the animals and the land and making sure we are looking after what we have. And I'm excited to start my journey and be the lifestyle specialist with Federated Farmers. So I've got a very short time frame. So if you've got any questions, we'll see if we can touch base on them at the end. But there is a number and an email that you can contact if you've got any queries and stuff like that. So we at Feds, we want to help people invest in their paradise, especially in the lifestyle area. We understand that we have really missed out on a few occasions where lifestyle farmers have really needed our help. That was a long time ago, so now we're getting hopefully to the right people and encouraging the right best management practices. And so like as you touched on before, rural recycling schemes, management of waterways, anything that you can do is helpful, and it makes a huge difference on the environment and your block and New Zealand in a whole. Sorry, I'm just going to skip through a couple of them. This I didn't make this PowerPoint, but it's quite lengthy. I think it was meant to be a half-an-hour presentation. This is like how we support each other. So we've got a local, regional and national government. At Feds, we've just started to recognise that there is a huge gap between the high country farmers and dairy and arable and you guys. You guys have different needs to what the other guys need. So we have started to get a lifestyle executive in all our provinces over New Zealand to give you guys a voice. So for example, so like our adverse events, this is when we realised that we weren't supporting you guys enough. As you guys would remember, the Pigeon Valley fires of 2019 and the Kaikoura earthquakes in 2016. Feds got involved, even though we didn't have the support there. We did our best. So we helped with both mental health, getting stock to higher ground, getting them away, getting them fed, whatever we could do. We rallied behind all the farmers that were affected in those events. On our website, so if you Google lifestyle Federated Farmers, it comes up with a whole lot of different fact sheets, and there's actually an adverse events survey that you can complete online for free, and it just gives you an idea of how important it is to make sure you're maintaining your land around shrubs, to make sure that it's not a fire risk. You're not mowing the lawns when it's really extremely dry and it's a huge hazard. Does have a lot of important points and tips and tricks that can help you get through some of those important adverse events. would like to become a member for Federated Farmers and go under our lifestyle products, we also give you a list of contacts which can support you and assist you. Say something really bad happens, they are there already for you. You would be registered in our Agri database and Federated Farmer networks. So you would be our first point of call. As you know, those floodings down in Canterbury, we were on the phones that night when we heard how bad it was, to try and see if there was anything we could do, whether it was stock, whether it was just helping the chickens out of the sheds. Yeah, so our goal is to support you guys. So we've got a lifestyle membership, which isn't as extensive as our high country dairy and all that, but it's just what you need. We understand that you don't have the restrictions that those other farmers do, but we want to know what you need. So like, I've jumped on this call a little bit naive and green about farm environmental plans, but I've learned, like, I've written 2 pages of notes, but I've learned a lot because I didn't realize a few of the things, because I've come off a high country station, so everything's a little bit different. But that's what we're here for, is learning and evolving with each other. And if you guys have feedback, if there's something, like if you become a member and you want more focus on something, then we want to hear that, because we're here to work for you. You are our members. We, as I said before, will advocate for lifestyle farms and small blocks, because we haven't had those executives in your area in the past to help you voice your concerns. There has been a bit of a delay on that. These are the fact sheets that I was talking about. So M. bovis is still out there, septic tank, animal care. If you do become a member, you get me. I am the lifestyle specialist. So if you've got any questions, I am there always for anyone that needs help. It's what I enjoy the most. Also, under the lifestyle memberships, we do offer a couple of agreements. So if you off-lease, grazing agreements, contract for service, if you need anything, like a handshake is good until things go wrong. So we'd like to help finalise that, and as a member you would get that at a discounted rate, which is always fun. There is a full website as well dedicated to lifestyle blocks, so you don't get all the huge policy stuff, you just get what is important to you guys. And who would benefit from us? Pretty much anyone who lives on a lifestyle block that owns animals. You, like, as a member, you would have access to a larger database. You would have access to anything that's coming through, like policies for regional or government councils. We would make sure that it was specific to you if that's all you wanted. Anyone that cares about the future of New Zealand rural, anything you do does impact the land, and that's why it's so important to do your best and encourage sustainability through good management practices. And yeah, if you're ever interested, jump on our website. All this PowerPoint is there, but there's a whole lot of other information. And yeah, you can get in contact. There's a few testimonials on there as well. And yeah, you can just get in contact by calling the 0800 FED number or jumping on our website, registering your interest. Just ask for me and I will get back to you and help you with any questions or anything you've got.
Excellent.
Perfect.
Thank you, Alicia. We better keep moving because Mirka's got
Sorry.
So Mirka, if you want to.
I'll try and talk fast now. I'll be
Sorry.
that's so good. Just Alicia, before I start, there was a question about with the farm plans and somebody leasing out their land, whose responsibility is for the farm plan. So I did put an answer in there, but I did suggest in my answer that maybe that's something, you know, because I know Federated Farmers has got share farm agreements and share Mirka agreements.
Yeah.
And obviously you've got, you just listed, you've got a lease agreement, whether that's something that could be in the, might already be in the template or could be put into that template to make it.
It is
easier.
already in the template.
Cool.
Who is required to do that. But yeah, if you've got that sort of questions, just sing out tomorrow.
Okay,
Yeah,
Lisa,
nice.
stop sharing your screen.
Yep, I will try and, oh yes, I'll wait for her to stop and then I'll try and add sharing my screen.
At the bottom, you should have a stop sharing screen.
It should be. Oops.
And mine is up the top. If you look up the top, it's.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, there we go. I was looking down the bottom. Different to James. Sorry about that.
It's all right.
No.
Off you go, Mirka.
Hang on. I need to now figure out how to share my screen. Here we go. Share screen. Yep. Share. Can you see that? That's not the one I'm sharing. That's no. It's doing the wrong one. Great. Hang on. I've got 3 screens going at the same time, so that's probably why. There we go. It's good, isn't it, Annette?
The stock DMP. That's the one you're up to.
Yeah, I know, but you can't see. So if I go onto the screen here, that's the one. Share. Can you see that or not?
Yeah, you just need to roll it up. Yes, we can see it, but you just go up back a few.
No, I don't think you can. You might have to share yours. Okay. I can just see a black page. That's awesome.
There you go.
There you go. Cool. Sorry. I did practice beforehand. I don't know why it didn't show up. Just before I go straight into stock good management practices, I wanted to say that so with there's 23 industry agreed good management practices, and their wording is really kind of not very defined. So what I will go through now is kind of just the practical implication, or what it actually means for you on your farm, sort of translating those good management practices into what the actions are on farm. So for example, when Annette was talking about critical source area mitigation before, there is a GMP number 3 and GMP number 6, and what it says is GMP 3 is manage farming operations to minimize direct and indirect losses of sediment and nutrients to water and maintain and enhance soil structure. So this is how the GMP is worded in the document, but what it really means is go and find your critical source areas and mitigate any runoff into water, which is what Annette was talking about. So for the good management practices to do with stock, the first one obviously is to exclude stock from waterways, and this has now been there's a difference between good management practices and actual regulation. So there are regulations that say you must exclude cattle, pigs and deers, and there's different, depending on the intensity of the stock, it's different times. But for most lifestylers, if you do have got pigs, cattle or deer, it will be 2025. But however, good management practice is that if you have a waterway, you should exclude your stock, even if it's sheep, for example. It's the best thing to do. What you'd have to, though, consider is reticulate your water. So for a lot of lifestylers, that becomes a problem because the stream is also the source of drinking water for your stock, and it's not quite as simple as just fencing it off. It's actually then putting water into a trough for them to drink. Under stock, there is a good management practice good management practice number 15, which talks about store, transport, and distribute feed to minimize wastage, leachate, and soil damage. So that pretty much means look at your feed out areas, because feed out areas could become critical source areas. If you feed out baleage, for example, and you do that at the corner of the paddock where there happens to be a drain, that can become a critical source areas, because the nutrient leaching from the baleage itself, or when the cows are standing there eating the baleage and kind of shitting at the same time, if that's close to a waterway, that becomes a critical source area. So you have to think about where you feed out in the paddock. And the other good management practice is the number 3 that I read out before. So it's minimize direct and indirect losses of sediments and enhance your soil structure. So that pretty much just means grace to the conditions. If you've got some really wet areas or areas prone to pugging, try not to put too much stock in there all at once when it's wet. So try and choose areas of your farm depending on the weather conditions to minimize any pugging. Just before I move on, if you look at the picture on the top right hand side, that, for example, the question is it a waterway that we're looking, is it a river or waterway that we're looking at or not? So it's not quite as black and white saying exclude your stock from waterways, because when I look at the top right hand picture, for example, I would call that an overland flow path. So an overland flow path is something that carries water after heavy rain, usually in the winter, but it's probably completely dry in the summer, and it's got grass at the bottom of it. So in the case as seen up there, you don't have to permanently fence it, but you should really put a temporary fence up in the winter when it's wet, so that the cows can't walk through it. Just want to move on, Annette, to the next one. So then winter grazing. Really, there's a difference between, and we didn't go into that in this presentation, but there's a difference between what's defined as intensive winter grazing and what is winter grazing. So I'm only going to talk about, really talk about winter grazing here. Intensive winter grazing is cattle or dairy cows on crop in the winter, whereas winter grazing is grazing in the winter when it's wetter and there's more risk. So the idea is that have a good winter grazing strategy. So if you know you've got areas on your farm that are more waterlogged than other areas, avoid grazing those in the winter, or avoid grazing them when it's wet in the winter. So make sure you've got enough grass as you enter the winter on the areas that are not so wet, so you can actually graze them in the wet times. Critical source areas, like the picture we saw before, shouldn't be cropped at all to start with. But if they're in grass, you should avoid grazing. So those critical source areas, if it has been wet and there's water flowing, just put up a temporary fence. There shouldn't be grazed at all until it's dry again. If you look at the picture up there, the grazing direction is actually really important. So the idea is, if you have a critical source area and you don't allocate a whole paddock in the winter, but you strip graze, you start as far away from the critical source area or the waterway as possible, and then leave the areas closest to the critical source area last. There was a study done in Southland where they compared catchment and they compared grazing directions, and the difference in sediment loss was just a very small catchment of about 4 paddocks with the critical source area in the middle, and just by following the above picture and grazing direction, they had 6 tons of sediment loss less than in the other catchment. So it does make a huge difference. And then the last part is, if you do winter cropping, it's a good management practice is that after the crop, don't put it straight into grass, but plant what they call a catch crop, for example, oats. So they take up more nutrients than just ryegrass. So it's kind of like a cleanup crop to take up the nutrients. Annette, if you want to go to the next one. So then for cultivating and cropping, the good management practice that is addressed here is Good Management Practice 4, which just says manage periods of exposed soil between crops and pasture to reduce the risk of erosion, overland flow, and leaching. So that, again, it comes to paddock selection. Usually machinery prevents you from doing that anyway, but don't crop on paddocks that are too steep. If you do crop on slope, it's quite important that you go sort of horizontally, not vertically, because that will actually slow. So as it rains, it will slow the water movement downhill. And if it slows the water movement downhill, it will also reduce the risk of loss of soil. Whereas if you crop up and down the slope, it forms channels for the water to flow, and therefore soil will be lost more likely. Again, the way you crop, good management practice is minimum tillage. Try and disturb the soil the least possible to maintain that healthy soil structure. And if it's winter cropping particularly, make sure you build in buffers. There has to be at least a 5-meter buffer between a winter crop and any waterway. If you want to move on. Annette. Next one then is hill erosion. So good management practice for hill erosion. There's a good management practice, which is management practice number 5, and that just says that you actually are supposed to retire all land that is classed as land use capability 8 or 7E. So it means very steep or prone to erosion. You can actually go on top of the south map, and there is what they call a LUC map, which will give you a map of your land and the number. So if it's 7 or 8, or 7E or 8, I should say, you shouldn't actually put any animals on there to start with. But any land that is lower than 7E or 8, and you do put animals on there, just if it's quite steep, avoid overgrazing. So yeah, avoid overgrazing. Be careful how you put your tracks in or other infrastructure that might lead to erosion. And if you have scenarios like the one seen in the picture, try and stabilize that erosion using planting. And as part of my role at Tasman District Council is I look after the poplar and willow nursery. So every year we harvest that nursery in about June and July. And if I have got leftover poplar poles, I give them out free to landowners to put in to reduce erosion. So this winter I gave out 1,200 poplar poles across the Tasman District for landowners to plant for free. So poplar poles are poplar trees are really straight, but the root system goes sort of wide, and they stabilize the bank, and the roots actually connect within the soil from one tree to another, holding that soil in place. So if you have got areas like the one seen on the picture and you want some poles, just email me and I'll put you on the list for next winter of ones to give away. You can move on, Annette, to the next one. So in terms, oh sorry, I thought someone was saying, in terms of stream erosion, really there is the good management practice really is to stop exclude your stream. And what I would say is, somebody else put this presentation together, but it says engineering, heart, bank, bettering, rocking. If you do anything within a waterway, if you put in any rocks or you start playing around with it with a digger or anything like this, just don't, because I think you need a resource consent. But what you can do is you can plant around the waterway to stop the erosion, and you don't need a resource consent for planting. But the idea is that when you exclude stock from your waterways, you actually protect the stream banks, because what happens often is if it's not stock excluded, the animals will trample down the sediments that will go from the and it will actually lead to bank erosion. The other way to reduce stream erosion is to actually slow down the movement of water. And the way to slow that down is by riparian planting and wetlands on your farm. So If you move on to the next one, Annette. So for wetland and riparian management areas, again, there isn't, in the good management practices, is really all comes under that GMP number 3, which is to minimize sediment and nutrient losses to water. So that's what you do by planting areas to waterways, because it will slow down the flow of water, it will filter the nutrients, and it will filter out the sediments, and it will therefore protect them from erosion. Don't do too much too fast. The idea is to just prioritize the areas that need fencing first, and once they're fenced off, start planning for the planting. And it's quite important to plan for the planting and just do an area at a time, because planting the plants is it doesn't take very long, but it's maintaining the plants and making sure they survive that takes a bit longer, and it takes a bit more planning. But Annette can help you there through all the resources through Landcare Trust and what's locally available. Yeah, biodiversity and enhancement. So there is 2 good management practices, number 22 and 23, and they just talk about that if you've got any areas of biodiversity, so native bush blocks, they should be protected, and weeds and pests should be controlled. So if you can, you should fence them off. But yeah, it depends on what kind of stock you've got and what the density of the stock is, whether they actually are a threat to that area or not. And also, I guess when you look on your map, think about wildlife corridors, you know, so you don't have a little bit over here and a little bit over there, but how can they be connected? Yeah. If you want to move on. Yeah, and fertilizer, nitrogen, juice. So there's 3 good management practices. Actually, no, sorry, there's 4 good management practices. The first one is that Alson P should be at or below optimum. So phosphate is bound to the soil particles. If the phosphate is above the level that should be optimum and you lose that soil particle, you also lose the phosphate into the environment. And that brings me to the next good management practices, which is actually test your soil before you put on any fertilizer, so that you only put on the amount of fertilizer that you need, because putting on too much fertilizer, obviously, I mean, it'll cost you unnecessarily a lot of money, but it will end up in the receiving environment. And another good management practice is then not just the amount of fertilizer, but the timing of the fertilizer. So don't apply fertilizer if it's heavy rain, or just prior to heavy rain, or when it's too cold. So usually when the plant is actively growing. But also don't apply particularly nitrogen fertilizer when it's too hot, or even worse, hot and windy. Or the worst thing that people do is they want to put on some nitrogen and they think, oh, we'll have a bit of moisture in the morning because we've got those dews. Don't put nitrogen fertilizer on then, because what will happen is you put on the nitrogen fertilizer, you get a little bit of moisture in the morning, and all it does is the fertilizer, which is a little round prill, will turn into a pancake, which gives it a larger surface area, and you'll actually lose a lot of that nitrate into the atmosphere, and it's just a whole lot of waste of money. So yeah, so the amount of fertilizer, the timing of the fertilizer, but there's also good management practices around storing and loading fertilizer. So you have to store it in a safe place, and you have to load it with minimal spillage. And lastly, there's a good management practice around the calibration of the spreader. So make sure that you calibrate the spreader before you spread, so you actually spread what you're meant to be spreading, and not double the amount in it. You know, financially, that's in your best interest. Anyway, and then what have I got written down there? Obviously, not too close to a waterway. And again, if you've got those riparian strips planted anyway, you're not going to fertilize over top, and it'll give it a good buffer. Next one, Annette. Perfect. So the next one is around infrastructure. And again, there's a good management practice around that, and that's to make sure that they call it GMP 7, it's that farm tracks, gateways, water troughs, self-feeding areas, stock hems and wallows are in a location that were designed in a way that they minimize runoff to water. So it's what Annette was saying before, all those features can become critical source areas if they are in the wrong place or designed in the wrong way. When I went on farms, what I particularly often see is the tracks and laneways, the way they're designed. So, for example, if there is a kink in them, so the animals run down the laneway and all of a sudden they have to do a sharp turn, they will stop and they will poo. And if that is right next to a waterway, all of that will go into a waterway. Bridges and culverts are real hot critical source areas. They need to be designed that any sediments or any sediments actually runs away from the waterway and not into the waterway, because that's a real critical source area. And then, like Annette was saying before, location of troughs have to be away from waterway. And Annette was already talking about wastewater and disposal. Yep, and I think that's still me. So I think, Annette, you already mentioned that before, but in your farm plan, everything, any mitigation has to be actually written down as actions. When I talk to the ones I've done farm plans for, when I talk to my farmers, I always talk about be realistic and talk about minimizing the loss of contaminants to waterways. Quite often I feel if we try and stop it all together, we probably have to have an engineering solution that's out of our financial capabilities. So it's being innovative to minimize the loss and then writing it down. So for example, think about silt fences you can put up, or hay bales you can place cleverly, or don't be afraid to switch things around on your farm so that the fence line is not just a straight line, but it actually follows a water course, for example. It's those kind of things. Anything else you wanted to add there, Annette? Or wasn't quite sure what else I was meant to say at this slide.
No, that's good.
Good, cool.
Yeah, so this is just looking at your next steps. Look at your property with farm environment planning eyes. Grab your gumboots and look at those critical source areas. Start the plan. Look at the map. Do your goals and consider whether you want to bring it all along to the in-person workshop, which we have a tentative date, don't we, Mirka? I just can't remember what it is, but I will be sending it out. I think it's the end of the month. And also, for those of you who, as a little reward to you, if you you can come along, we've got some surplus seedlings. We've got 3 community work nurseries for the Moutere catchment, and we have some surplus seedlings. And so I will organise a pot-up event, so you can come along and you can pot up these seedlings in root trainers, and the potting mix will be supplied, and you can take them home and grow them on, and they will be about ready to be planted in your on your property in next winter. So that is and I want to be a little bit, my expectation of coming along to that event is that you will actually complete your farm environment plan and include a planting plan in it of where you're going to put it. So in case you were worried that you don't have enough resources, these are all the resources that are currently held on the Moutere page. You can see that they're numbered. Some of you will have no interest in some, and some of you, so that's why they're all separate. And there are the YouTube things that are on land management units, soils, erosion, critical source areas, these are 2-hour talks on those particular topics. There's a 2-hour talk on planting and weed control, and then there's another one on good management practices. So those are all there, and shortly there'll be another 2-hour podcast. So when you're out there looking after your property, like me, because I'm a lifestyler, and sometimes the only way I can do that is having something interesting to listen to while I do the monotonous task of clearing around my plants or weed whacking or whatever. You can listen to that podcast. So the only question that came through on that last session was whether to plant exotics or natives. And the purest answer will be natives are always best for our biodiversity, for our birds and things. But sometimes if you have an eroding bank and you need something to hold it fast, then you might consider putting in a poplar pole or bitter willows. Please don't put in crack willows because they're a wilding weed. But yeah, there's sometimes case for both. And yeah, how do you calculate carbon income is the question. There is on the ETS scheme, there is different tables for different tree species that will calculate out your carbon that they accrue. If you have forestry and you're going to harvest that, then there will be a deduction as the wood leaves the farm. But in terms of natives, there are tables there. For instance, approximately off the top of my head, natives will generate around about 6 tonne of carbon per hectare. And currently the carbon price is $50 a tonne. So that's the way that you would get the carbon income. However, there's a whole lot to that. You have to have at least 1 hectare. There has to be a minimum of 30 metres. You can actually get a free assessment of what you can register already on your property through Carbon Corp, which is a local Nelson-based product. And if you do decide to register for carbon, they will do all of that for you, fill in all the reports. They'll take 10% of the carbon for it to do. So if you are thinking of looking at carbon-free income from your native plantings, it's a really good idea to get that assessment. You can, for instance, Mirka talked about poplar poles. If you're short of a few meters, like you're supposed to have 30 meters on average across your area, you can plant some poplar poles in your paddock with the stock can still graze around and expand out your area to 30 meters if you need. Right, I'm going to stop Steam sharing, and feel free to ask any verbal questions that you wish, because we've got 4 minutes to go. But yeah, has anybody got any questions, anything that they're unsure of having listened to that talk? Feel free to unmute yourself. Lawson, have you got anything to add? Seeing you're our resident wetland and look after the water guy. This is a test, you see. I'm seeing if he's actually listening, or he's gone off and had a coffee. Looks like he's gone off and had a coffee.
Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. Just technology problems. I'm here. Yeah, no, that was pretty good. I think you covered everything pretty well. Couple of questions about natives that come up. It comes back to what you're wanting to achieve, but in my experience, some exotics can still provide pretty good habitat and food for native species. So just because it's not native, it doesn't mean to say that it won't provide valuable food or habitat for native birds. Yeah, otherwise, I think you've covered everything pretty well. I did see actually somebody asked about if anybody's doing regenerative farming. I've just planted a couple of hectares in soil restart mix, I think, from Symbiosis Farming. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes as far as improving soil quality and hopefully reduce the amount of drainage and water holding improve the water holding capacity. So down the track, I'm happy to, if anybody wants to have a look at that, happy to show them around.
If anybody's interested in that sort of thing, Nelson Pines has got large amounts of biochar ash that comes out of their processing plant. So if somebody wants to add, for instance, biochar to their soil, and they're going to cultivate their soil, that product's available.
Who are they, please?
Nelson Pine.
Thank you.
Any other questions for people? So you're all very confident in having a crack at doing your farm environment plan?
You're joking.
Just start it. And maybe I should just show you. So that list of resources looks quite daunting, but in fact, they're nice, simple sort of 4 pages at most. They're written for lifestylers. So anything that you feel like you don't know enough about, you can do that and just have a go. And Mirka and I will hopefully, she tells me on the 30th of November, and depending on what you've said on your survey about when you'd prefer to come, we'll run an event where you can bring your farm environment plan along and ask all those questions where you got stuck. And so by the end of that meeting, you should be able to finish your farm environment plan, and you'll have some actions. If you're like anybody else that's done this thing and you won't know quite how to go about it, then you'll be able to ask. And hopefully I'll get, I'm going to try and get Peter from Westbank Natives to come along to it too, because you can answer all the questions about all the biodiversity. So there you go, Lawson, there's a message for you. Ian is interested in regenerative farming.
Yeah, I mean, if anybody wants to contact me, probably contact me at Fish and Game is probably just as easy, because I can talk about, well, a bit about that and about water, if anybody wants to know about water quality or stream health, that kind of stuff. I can probably put my Fish and Game hat on. So I only work Mondays and Tuesdays at Fish and Game. The rest of the time I play farm and various other things. So, but feel free to contact me there.
Okay, so anybody got any final questions? Right.
Until I had a go.
It was great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Excellent. And you can also email me if you need. Yes, I will send the link to the resource pages, but believe me, if you just Google Moutere, Catchment and New Zealand Landcare Trust, it'll just pop up. But I will be sending out this recording and the link to all the resources. And the first version of the Farm Environment Plan template had a few sections that didn't work. I noticed that today, so I've emailed you all out a corrected version, so use that one. Okay, well, thank you all very much. Thank you, Mirka.
Cool. Thanks, guys. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Excellent.